Hi there everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm the GCSE science teacher. In today's video we're going to be learning about a topic called thermoregulation, and this is part of the homeostasis module which is found in paper 2 content for GCSE biology. If you do enjoy this video, which I hope you do, feel free to give it a big thumbs up, share it with someone else so they don't miss out on any key revision, and also do subscribe if you haven't already. I'm really grateful, by the way, for everyone who has recently subscribed. We've recently, today as I'm filming this, hit 70 subscribers here on my channel, so thank you so much. It really is amazing. I'm quite shocked, if I'm honest. It's just lovely that so many of you are interested in supporting this channel, so thank you ever so much. If you're new and you've just subscribed, welcome. I'm a real life science teacher. I teach biology, chemistry and physics, and A-level biology as well. I do this in my spare time just to help students across the globe essentially get better grades in science and also enjoy science. So if you are new, hello and welcome, and let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is knowing what thermoregulation even means. So it sounds kind of confusing, but thermoregulation just means regulating the temperature inside our body. And that's really important we do this because actually our body is made up of loads of different substances, including things like enzymes. And you may have already learned before that enzymes are essentially biological catalysts. They help speed up the rate of reactions going on inside our body. However, if the temperature raises too much higher than 37 degrees, which is kind of the optimal temperature our core body temperature is at and how best enzymes in our body work, those enzymes can actually denature, and that's when their active site starts to essentially deform into a different shape, and therefore the substrate can no longer bind to that active site and they no longer work. You only ever want to say they denature. You never want to say enzymes die or are killed because they're not living, so we can't really use that terminology. So how is temperature even regulated in the first place? Well, it all happens in a very important part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And I recently did a video about the different structures and areas of the brain, and I highly recommend you watch that one just to give you a bit of further context into what I'm talking about. I'll link it for you. But the hypothalamus essentially is a really important part of the brain because it has this area called the thermoregulatory center, and essentially it works with other parts of the body, specifically receptors that are found in the blood and all around the body, kind of acting as a way to monitor the temperature of the blood. And if the temperature gets too high, a series of events will happen. If the temperature gets too low, again, another series of events will happen. And as with anything in this module with homeostasis, it's just talking about the balance within our body and maintaining optimal levels for enzyme action and cellular function. So that's essentially what's happening. Our body is constantly trying to maintain a perfect optimal condition, such as temperature. We also know that glucoregulation and water levels, those are also controlled by this homeostatic mechanism. And we will talk more about osmoregulation, aka how water is kind of maintained, but also how much glucose is in the blood and in the body. So that's glucoregulation and kind of what happens if those two things don't necessarily work effectively and those mechanisms don't work. So we're going to cover that in another couple of videos time. So keep an eye out for that. Click subscribe if you haven't already. So what happens to our body if our core temperature rises way above that optimal level? Well, receptors in our blood will receive that information, receive that stimulus, and send it through a network of different neurons to the hypothalamus, that thermoregulatory center. And that information is then passed on to a range of neurons again to then receive that information by effectors. Now, effectors, as I mentioned in my previous video about the nervous system, I'll link it if you've not seen it. Those effectors could be muscles which contract to cause a response, or they could be glands that either release hormones typically, or they can also release other substances. In the case of this one, they're actually releasing sweat because sweat glands are the effectors in this case, and they are activated when the core body temperature rises. And sweat essentially is liquid water, may contain other minerals or the salts, that kind of thing. But essentially that liquid water, once it's released, it sits on the surface of our skin, and as it starts to evaporate through essentially being heated up by our bodies temperature, our core body temperature, it transfers some of the thermal energy, some of that heat energy into the environment, and that is what cools us down. And that's kind of a key idea that you need to be aware of in the exam. The other thing that happens, not only do we sweat more, but there's this other process, this other physiological process called vasodilation. And essentially, vasodilation is when blood vessels, specifically capillaries, actually expand, they dilate, hence the name. And essentially, this causes more blood to pass through, and therefore that helps with the cooling down process. And vasodilation is a key idea, again, that you must kind of understand and know. Okay, so what happens to our body when we get too cold? Well, if the core body temperature drops lower than that 37 degrees Celsius mark, our receptors in our blood will actually detect this just like before, and the nervous impulses will be sent to the hypothalamus. And again, there will be a set of mechanisms which happen. The first thing that will happen, or one of the things that will happen, is that the skeletal muscle, that striated muscle, will start to contract. And this is how we start to shiver. So when you're shivering, it's because your muscles are contracting. And this actually requires energy. And this energy comes from respiration. Remember, glucose is broken down with oxygen, sometimes without, if it's in the case of anaerobic respiration. But respiration happens in all living cells. And as respiration is occurring, heat is also released. And this kind of helps to warm our body up. Also, we have on the surface of our skin very small hairs called vellus hairs. You might not even notice them. They're all over our body. And essentially what they do is they stand up on end. And this is because of the muscles in our skin. They actually cause the muscles to contract, and the hairs, the vellus hairs, will actually stand up on end. And this will trap some of the air in the surrounding environment. And this essentially acts as a layer of insulation. So it's not the hair that we'd see. Some types of hair that you even have on your face, on your arms, on your legs, you might not be able to see this, but essentially it will stand up on end and trap that heat. And that's really useful in keeping us warm. Lastly, the other thing you must know is something called vasoconstriction. And this is, again, a physiological process where blood vessels, such as capillaries, actually constrict and get narrower. So the lumen of those capillaries will actually get narrower and are no longer as wide as they were before. And this essentially reduces the blood flow to conserve thermal energy. And that's kind of why sometimes, if we're out in very cold environments, our fingertips, our extremities, like our nose, they can actually go a little bit red, and can discolor in some way. So that's something that can kind of highlight that the environment's very, very cold. And if this happens for a really prolonged period of time, it can actually lead to some really dangerous kind of conditions, such as frostbite and things like that. So obviously this is something that our body does to kind of protect our internal organs and make sure that our core temperature and all that blood flow is going to our internal organs. And that's essentially what's happening in that case. I know, by the way, I mentioned about striated muscle, but just as a bit of a recap, remember there's actually 3 types of muscle. We have skeletal or striated, which is found attached to our bones. We have cardiac muscle, which is found in our heart. And we also have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, remember, is a type of muscle that doesn't really respond to voluntary or kind of conscious thought. So you'd find it in the esophagus or the digestive system in some way. Remember, the esophagus is essentially a muscular tube that helps with peristalsis, which is a type of kind of like a contraction that helps move the food down into the lower digestive system, like the stomach. So just as a bit of a recap, those are a couple of extra bits I thought I'd add in. Okay, so everything I've just described is something called a negative feedback loop. And one thing I've learned from teaching students over the years is a lot of students struggle with this idea of negative feedback, not getting negative feedback, not that sense of things. Feedback's important, but what I mean is this idea of negative feedback in biology. It's a term used to kind of describe a series of events to go from one thing to back to a kind of a good level, a base level. So for example, we know the optimal level for core body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius, give or take a few decimal points here and there. But if the temperature gets too high, a series of events will occur to get it back to the optimal level. And the same can be said for if it gets too low. Those sequence of events are what we call a negative feedback loop. So everything I've just described, if they ever ask you in the exam to describe negative feedback or what it is, or give an example, or maybe explain the steps in the negative feedback loop for thermoregulation. It's essentially what we've just talked about here. And if you have any questions about it, or you want to learn a bit more about negative feedback in this situation, please do let me know. Comment down below. But hopefully that helps clarify a few things, because students often ask about it. And that's pretty much it from me. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a big thumbs up, share it with someone else, and also do subscribe. We are so close to hitting 100 subscribers here on YouTube. It's really incredible that so many of you are excited as I am about science. So thank you so much for joining me here. If you do want more of my content for GCSE biology, chemistry, or physics, feel free to check out my other videos on my channel. I have tried to organize them in playlists for you, so that should be helpful. But also I have an Instagram and TikTok. Everything is at the GCSE Science Teacher. And if you do want any support with GCSEs, if there's anything specifically you'd like me to cover, whether it's, I don't know, paper 2 content, paper 1, whatever it is, do let me know. Just comment down below and I will get back to you. In the meantime, I've been the GCSE Science Teacher and you have been curious. Have a fantastic day and I will see you in the next one.